The video was 47 seconds long. My daughter-in-law had posted it to a private family group chat. Private, except that my sister-in-law forwarded it to me by accident, along with a laughing emoji she hadn't meant for my eyes. I watched it 3 times on a Tuesday morning, while my coffee went cold on the granite countertop, the kind of cold that creeps in so slowly you don't notice until it's already happened. In the video, my son Marcus is seated at the head of a dining table I paid for, in a house whose mortgage I had quietly supplemented for 6 years, surrounded by his wife's family and 2 of my own grandchildren, laughing at a joke his father-in-law had made. The joke was about me. Pathetic failure were the exact words. Marcus didn't correct him. He laughed harder than anyone at the table, and when his wife reached over and squeezed his arm, that intimate little gesture of shared contempt, I noted the date, the time, and the specific quality of his laugh, not because I was wounded, because I am a woman who keeps records, and that laugh had just become evidence. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I did not cry. I did not call Marcus. I did not fire off a message into that group chat demanding an explanation or an apology, because people who demand apologies have already surrendered the advantage. I closed the video, set my phone face down on the counter, and finished my coffee cold, because cold coffee is still coffee, and the temperature of a thing does not change what it is. Then I drove to the office of my estate attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who has handled my affairs for 19 years and who has, on more than one occasion, told me I have the most organized financial documentation he has ever encountered in a private client. I took that as the highest compliment of my life. Gerald's office smells like lemon wood polish and old paper, the kind of paper that has absorbed decades of other people's most consequential decisions. His desk is mahogany, his diplomas are framed in black, and he has a habit of folding his hands before delivering information he suspects you will find unpleasant. That morning, he did not need to fold his hands, because I was not there to receive unpleasant information. I was there to give instructions. I slid a single printed document across his desk, a reorganization outline I had drafted over the previous 4 months methodically, the way I do everything, and I watched his eyes move down the page with the focused attention of a man who charges $400 an hour and understands he is earning every cent of it. I should tell you how we arrived here. Not for sympathy. I don't traffic in sympathy, but because the architecture of a betrayal matters. The load-bearing walls of a family's collapse don't appear overnight. They were always there, quietly bowing under the weight of assumptions the powerful make about the patient. My husband, Raymond, died 11 years ago and left behind a moderately complex estate. The house on Delford Lane, 3 commercial properties, a brokerage account, and a life insurance policy with a face value that made the funeral director visibly recalculate his opinion of us. Raymond had been a methodical man, but not a suspicious one. His will was clean and simple. The kind of document that assumes everyone named in it is acting in good faith. That assumption was Raymond's only error, and it was a significant one. Marcus was 31 when his father died. He had, by that point, already demonstrated a pattern of financial instability that Raymond had funded in the same quiet, unconditional way you refill a glass that keeps getting knocked over, without comment, without condition, without the simple demand that the person holding the glass learn to use 2 hands. I continued that pattern after Raymond died because I believed, with a conviction I now recognize as the most expensive mistake of my life, that my son's dysfunction was temporary, that he was circling, that the money I was moving into his accounts, through what I structured as a series of documented personal loans, never gifts, always loans, always with signed acknowledgement, was the bridge to a version of Marcus that was simply taking longer to arrive than expected. The loans totaled, across 6 years, $412,000. I have every signed acknowledgement in a fireproof safe in my home office, organized chronologically with corresponding bank transfer records stapled behind each document. Marcus has in 6 years repaid $9,000. He told his father-in-law's family that mother was a pathetic failure while sitting in a house I had helped him keep. What Marcus did not know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks before that dinner, I had already filed the paperwork to convert the revocable living trust Raymond, and I had established into an irrevocable structure with a very specific distribution clause. And I had done something else, something that would not become visible to Marcus until the moment I chose to make it visible, and that moment was now precisely 4 months away. Gerald Foss set the reorganization outline down after 6 minutes of reading. I timed and folded his hands exactly once before looking up at me. He did not ask if I was certain. Gerald has known me long enough to understand that I do not sit into his mahogany office on a Tuesday morning with a 4-month-old document unless certainty was established somewhere around month 2. What he asked instead was whether I had considered the notification requirement under the trust's existing terms, because the original instrument required a 30-day written notice to all named beneficiaries before any structural amendment could be executed. I told him I had considered it. I told him the notice had already been drafted, that it was intentionally written in the precise legal language the instrument required and nothing more, and that I had mailed it to Marcus's address 11 days ago via certified post. Gerald's expression did not change, but his pen moved slightly on the legal pad in front of him, which is his version of being impressed. The certified letter had been signed for by Marcus's wife, Delia, on a Thursday at 2:14 in the afternoon. I know this because the US EAPS tracking system logs the timestamp, and I had screenshot that confirmation and saved it to a folder on my desktop, labeled, without irony, administrative. What the letter communicated in the language of trust law was a formal notice of proposed amendment. Dry, procedural, the kind of correspondence most people skim and set aside because it reads like a utility bill with a law firm's return address. Marcus had not called me about it. He had not texted. The 30-day window under the trust's terms was a window for objection, and his silence was not indifference. It was forfeiture, documented by the timestamp on a federal postal record. What I had structured across those 4 months of quiet drafting was not an act of rage. I want that understood. Rage is a blunt instrument, and blunt instruments leave marks on the person swinging them as often as on the target. What I had built was a legal architecture so precisely fitted to the situation that it would appear, to anyone examining it later, to be nothing more than the prudent estate planning of a 63-year-old woman with significant assets and a reasonable concern for their organized distribution. The irrevocable trust I was converting to contained 3 modifications that individually were unremarkable. Together, they formed a mechanism with a single directional function, and that direction was not toward Marcus. The first modification was a spendthrift provision embedded in the distribution clause that prohibited any beneficiary from assigning, pledging, or borrowing against their interest in the trust before distribution. This is standard language in estate planning. No competent attorney would flag it as unusual. What it meant in practice was that Marcus could not use his anticipated inheritance as collateral, which I had learned, through a conversation with his financial advisor, that Marcus had carelessly seeded me on 8 months prior. He had already begun discussing with a private lender. That door was now sealed quietly with language that predated any lender's inquiry. The second modification was a no-contest clause with a scope I had asked Gerald to draft broadly. Any legal challenge to the trust's structure, any petition to the probate court questioning the amendment's validity, any formal dispute of the distribution schedule would result in the automatic forfeiture of the contesting party's entire interest. Not a reduction, a forfeiture. Marcus would have to weigh the cost of a legal fight against the certainty of losing everything if he lost that fight. And Marcus, whatever his failures, is not stupid enough to take those odds. The third modification was the one Gerald had paused longest on during his read. It was a loan offset clause, a provision I had drafted with a forensic accountant named Patricia Wren, who had spent 2 weeks building a documented ledger of every personal loan I had extended to Marcus since Raymond's death. $412,000, less than $9,000 repaid, left a net figure of $403,000 that the trust's distribution engine would now treat as an advance against Marcus's share of the estate before any distribution calculation was performed. In plain terms, Marcus's inheritance would be reduced, dollar for dollar, by every cent I had ever given him that he had signed a loan acknowledgement for. He had signed everyone. He had signed them in the same casual, slightly distracted way people sign for packages at the door, present enough to complete the motion, not present enough to understand what the paper meant. Patricia had cross-referenced every signature against the bank transfer records. The documentation was immaculate. Gerald looked at me for a long moment after I finished walking him through the third modification. The lemon polish and old paper smell of his office settled around us, and somewhere in the building a door closed with the particular resonance of solid wood in a quiet hallway. He asked me one question. Had I spoken with Marcus recently? I told him I had not spoken to Marcus in 6 weeks, and that our last conversation had been a request from Marcus for an additional $40,000 to address what's described as a temporary cash flow disruption in his contracting business. I told Gerald I had said I would think about it. Gerald nodded slowly, the nod of a man assembling a complete picture from its final piece, and reached for his phone to call his paralegal. The amendment paperwork, he said, could be execution ready within 10 business days. I drove home through light rain, the kind that doesn't require wipers at full speed, just the intermittent setting. That slow, rhythmic sweep that sounds like a clock counting down something you haven't named yet. Marcus still hadn't called about the certified letter. He had, however, texted me 2 days after it arrived to ask whether I had given any more thought to the 40,000. I had read the text, set the phone down, and thought about the 47-second video. About the laugh. About his father-in-law's hand on the table and the word pathetic. Delivered with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that the woman being discussed might be listening and building. Patricia Wren had an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown that smelled like recycled air and fresh printer ink. The kind of office for sure is deliberately unremarkable because the work happening inside it is anything but. She was 51, small-framed, and had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where numbers told stories that people wished they didn't. When I first retained her, 8 months before the Tuesday of the video, she had asked me a single qualifying question. Did I want a picture of what the money had done? Or did I want a picture of what the money meant? I told her both. She had nodded, opened a new client folder, and we had not wasted a single subsequent meeting on anything that wasn't directly documentable. The ledger she built across those 8 months was not simply a list of transfers. It was a narrative constructed entirely from bank records, signed acknowledgments, and time-stamped correspondence that told the story of a woman who had given consistently and a son who had received without memory. Patricia had organized it in 3 columns: date of transfer, amount, and the stated purpose Marcus had provided in writing at the time of each loan. Some of the stated purposes were specific: bridge financing for the Kellerman subcontract, emergency HVAC replacement, Delford property, Delia's hospitalization deductible, March. Others were vague in the way that reveals more than specificity does: short-term liquidity, general business needs, Miss Personal. The Miss Personal entries totaled $68,000 across 4 years. I had signed every transfer. Marcus had signed every acknowledgement. Patricia had color-coded the ledger in a way that made the pattern visible at a single glance, and the pattern was not subtle. What I had not told Marcus, across 6 years of loans and signed acknowledgments, was that I had retained Patricia at all. This was not deception. I was under no obligation to disclose the existence of my own financial documentation to a borrower, but it was a form of information asymmetry that I had maintained with deliberate care. Marcus believed, I am certain, that our financial arrangement existed in the same informal register as most family money. Present, occasionally discussed, fundamentally unserious. He had signed the acknowledgments the way people agree to terms and conditions on software updates, with the physical compliance and complete. Cognitive absence of someone who has decided the document in front of them is not the kind of document that will ever matter. Patricia's ledger was the proof that it mattered. Gerald's trust amendment was the mechanism that would make it consequential. Together, they formed the 2 halves of something I had never needed to name aloud to anyone. Because naming a thing before it is complete is how careful work becomes careless. The $40,000 Marcus had requested, the one he had texted me about while the certified notice of trust amendment sat unread on what I assumed was his kitchen counter, I had decided after 3 days of consideration not to provide. Not because I lacked the funds, and not because I had reached some emotional threshold of enough. I declined it because extending another loan at that precise moment would have introduced a new entry into Patricia's ledger that postdated the trust amendment filing, and I was not willing to allow even the appearance of ambiguity about my intent. Gerald had used the phrase clean record of decision in our second meeting, and I had written it down. A clean record of decision means that every action you take is legible, documented, and consistent with a single coherent narrative. The narrative I was building had no room for a $40,000 footnote that a creative attorney could later characterize as evidence of ongoing goodwill. I texted Marcus back on a Wednesday evening, while the rain from earlier in the week had given way to the particular dry cold that settles into a house in the hours before midnight. I told him I wasn't able to assist with the request at this time, and that I hoped the business situation resolved itself. 11 words. He responded 4 minutes later with a message that ran to 3 paragraphs, the kind of message that begins with disappointment and escalates through grievance before arriving at a conclusion that is, structurally, a demand dressed in the language of a request. He mentioned that Raymond would have helped without question. He mentioned that Delia's family had offered to step in, but that he had wanted to come to me first, out of respect. He used the word respect in a sentence that also contained a veiled suggestion that my reluctance was evidence of a coldness he had always sensed in me but never wanted to believe was real. I read it once, the way you read a document you already understand, and I saved the screenshot to the same folder as the postal tracking confirmation. The folder now contained 43 items. Gerald's paralegal had confirmed that morning that the amendment execution date was set for the following Friday, 8 days away. Marcus had 6 days remaining in his 30-day objection window, and he had spent those days not consulting an attorney, not calling me to discuss the notice, and not reading the document carefully enough to understand what was already in motion. He had spent them asking for $40,000 and invoking his dead father's generosity as leverage. The grandfather clock in my front hallway marked the hour with 8 deliberate strokes, each one clean and unhurried, the sound of time moving at exactly the pace it intends to keep. The amendment executed on a Friday at 11:20 in the morning, in Gerald's office, with 2 witnesses and a notary whose stamp landed on the signature page, the specific finality of something that cannot be unstamped. I had worn a charcoal blazer and carried the leather portfolio Raymond had given me for our 25th anniversary, the one with my initials pressed into the lower right corner in gold that had softened over the years to the color of old honey. I mention this not for sentiment, but because the details of consequential moments deserve to be held accurately. Gerald signed as the trustee co-executor. His paralegal witnessed, and the notary, a compact woman named Cherise who worked out of Gerald's building and had witnessed documents for him for 12 years, pressed her seal into the paper with the same businesslike efficiency she brought to everything, which I respected enormously. The irrevocable trust, with all 3 modifications intact, was now a sealed instrument. It could not be altered without a court order and a showing of fraud or incapacity. Neither of those conditions existed, and neither would. Marcus called me that afternoon at 4:47. Not about the trust. The amendment had not yet been formally served on him, because the instrument's terms required notification of execution within 15 business days, and Gerald and I had agreed to use the full window. Marcus called because he had found another lender willing to advance against his anticipated inheritance, and he wanted to know, in the careful phrasing of someone who has rehearsed a question, whether I had any plans to make significant changes to my estate structure in the near term. I let the question settle for a moment before I answered. I told him I was always reviewing my planning and that Gerald handled those matters. I told him if he had specific concerns, he was welcome to have his own attorney reach out to Gerald's office. Marcus said he didn't think that was necessary, that he was just asking, that he hoped we were on the same page. I told him we were, which was true. We were both on the same page, and that page was now a notarized, irrevocable document filed with Gerald's office and backed by $403,000 in signed loan acknowledgments. The page simply said different things to each of us. What followed over the next 11 days was a particular quality of silence I had not anticipated. Not because it surprised me, but because I had not prepared myself for how textured it would be. Marcus did not call again. Delia sent a brief text asking if I was available for dinner the following Sunday, the kind of social maintenance message that functions as ambient relationship upkeep rather than genuine invitation. And I replied that I had a prior commitment, which I did. I had scheduled a second meeting with Patricia to review the final ledger formatting, before it was attached as an exhibit to the trust documentation. My grandchildren sent nothing, because they are 7 and 9 and are not yet participants in the architecture of adult grievance, which is the only mercy the situation contained. The house on Delford Lane, where I had lived for 31 years, was very quiet in those 11 days, and I did not find the quiet uncomfortable. I had spent years filling silence with accommodation, with the low-grade noise of managing other people's instability, and the absence of that noise had a quality I can only describe as structural, like a room that finally has the right amount of furniture. On the 12th day, Gerald's office sent the execution notification to Marcus via certified mail and electronic delivery to the email address on file, with the trust, an address Marcus had provided 6 years ago, and, based on the auto-earn receipt Gerald's system generated, still actively used. The notification was 4 pages. Page 1 was a cover letter from Gerald's firm. Pages 2 and 3 were the executed amendment in full, including all 3 modification clauses. Page 4 was Patricia's ledger summary, not the full 43-page document, just the 1-page summary that showed the net loan balance of $403,000 and the bolded line at the bottom that read, "Outstanding loan balance to be offset against beneficiary distribution prior to calculation of net share." Gerald had wanted to omit the ledger summary from the initial notification, on the grounds that it was supplementary documentation that could be provided upon request. I had disagreed. I wanted Marcus to see the number on the same day he read the amendment. I wanted the architecture visible all at once, the way you understand a building differently when you see the whole facade rather than one wall at a time. Marcus called Gerald's office 17 minutes after the electronic delivery timestamp. Gerald's paralegal, following the protocol we had established, informed him that all inquiries regarding the trust amendment should be directed to Gerald in writing, that Mr. Foss was not available for unscheduled calls regarding active estate instruments, and that a formal consultation could be arranged with a minimum of 5 business days' notice. Marcus called my phone 4 minutes after that. I watched his name on the screen through 2 full rings, the grandfather clock behind me marking the half hour with a single unhurried stroke, and I did not answer. I was not ready to speak to Marcus yet, not because I needed more time to prepare, but because the moment a person answers a call they did not choose to receive, they have already surrendered something, and I had not spent 4 months building a sealed instrument to surrender anything now. I returned Marcus's call on a Monday morning, 6 days after he had made it. Not because I had been avoiding him, avoidance implies discomfort, and I felt none, but because 6 days was the amount of time it took for 2 specific things to occur. The first was a letter from an attorney named Devlin Marsh, whose letterhead identified him as a partner at a firm specializing in trust and estate litigation, informing Gerald's office that he had been retained by Marcus to review the amendment's validity and explore potential grounds for challenge. Gerald had forwarded it to me the same afternoon it arrived, with a single line of annotation in the margin. No contest clause applies. Advise client accordingly. The second thing that occurred in those 6 days was that Marcus, through Devlin Marsh, had filed a preliminary inquiry with the probate court requesting documentation of the amendment process, a procedural step that, under the no contest clause's broad scope, constituted a formal dispute of the trust structure. Devlin Marsh had either not read the clause carefully enough, or he had read it and believed it wouldn't hold. Gerald believed it would hold. Patricia, when I called her, said the ledger documentation made the loan offset clause unassailable. I called Gerald back and told him to prepare the no contest forfeiture notice. When I finally called Marcus, he answered on the first ring, which told me everything about the 6 days he had just lived through. His voice had the compressed quality of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation so many times that the rehearsal has worn the words thin. He said my name. I said his. There was a pause. And in that pause, I heard the specific texture of a man who had expected the call to begin differently, perhaps with an apology, perhaps with a softening, perhaps with the particular maternal retreat he had learned, over decades, to expect when he pushed hard enough in the right emotional register. I did not retreat. I told him I had retained Gerald's office to proceed with the no contest forfeiture provision, that the filing of Devlin Marsh's probate inquiry had triggered the clause automatically, and that Gerald would be in contact with Marsh's office by end of week. Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them. What he said next, I had also prepared for, because I know my son and I know the sequence of his defenses. He moved through them in order. First, that I was being vindictive, that this wasn't the woman who raised him. Then, that Raymond would never have done this. Then, that Delia and the children would suffer. And did I understand what I was doing to my own grandchildren? Each argument was structurally the same argument, a claim that my actions required justification against some version of myself I was supposed to still be performing, the mother who absorbed, the widow who needed to be needed, the woman who had quietly paid $412,000 in documented loans and received, in return, a 47-second video in which her son laughed at the word pathetic with his whole chest. I let him finish. I did not argue with any of it, because you do not argue with a sequence of emotional appeals by engaging them on their own terms. You acknowledge them and remain still, the way a building remains still in wind, not because it cannot be moved, but because its foundation was poured for exactly this weather. I told Marcus 3 things. The first was that the no contest forfeiture was not vindictive. It was contractual, and it had been contractual since the moment Devlin Marsh filed the probate inquiry, which Marcus had authorized. The second was that the loan offset clause, backed by $403,000 in documentation he had personally signed, was not a punishment but an accounting, the kind Raymond, who had been a precise and fair man, would have recognized as exactly that. The third thing I told him was that I had loved him without condition for 37 years, and that unconditional love and unconditional financial exposure were not the same thing, and I should have understood that distinction earlier than I did. That was the only admission I made, and I made it without apology, because it was accurate rather than concessive. Marcus said nothing for a long time after that. Outside my window, the morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes the bare trees look deliberate, like something designed rather than merely dormant. The forfeiture notice was served 3 days later. Devlin Marsh withdrew from the matter within a week, which Gerald interpreted as the attorney's recognition that the clause would survive any challenge the filing had inadvertently triggered. Marcus's interest in the trust under the executed forfeiture provision had reduced to zero, not as a dramatic gesture, not as the conclusion of an argument, but as the logical terminus of a legal mechanism he had set in motion himself by authorizing a filing he hadn't read carefully enough to understand. Patricia closed the client folder and invoiced me for the final month of work. I paid it the same afternoon, transferred the funds with the same precision I had brought to every transaction in the preceding 8 months, and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a thing that is finished. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked forward, unhurried, keeping its own time, indifferent to whether the room around it was full or empty, which is the only way to keep time worth keeping.